10 Life Lessons from Philosophy and Psychology. In this video, I'd like to explore some of the deepest lessons I've learned from my contact with philosophy and psychology over the last 30 years or so. Of course, I should probably say at the outset that the things I've gained through the years may be very different from what's relevant to you and your life. So, you should feel free to disregard or modify anything I'm saying here so that it fits your own life experience better. Okay, a few more qualifiers. This list is a work in progress. I might change my mind about part or all of it later today. There's nothing in this video that should be treated as if it were written in stone. It's just an expression of what seems important in life to me these days. Anyhow, I pretty much agree with Oscar Wilde, who held that consistency is the last refuge of the unimaginative. Okay, now that we've finished with the qualifiers, I'd like to begin by saying that one thing I've learned from my contact with philosophy and psychology is to focus mostly on the truths that seem to have enough evocative poetic resonance to affect me and other people in profound and personal ways. The kinds of truth that expand our perceptual fields and that call us into the deeper reaches of life. But I've also learned that these truths constitute just a tiny subset of all of the truths that populate the academic world. That's why most of us find it easy to forget the majority of the truths we've absorbed in the academic classes we've taken, after just a year or two. It's because most of those truths were eminently forgettable in the first place. They weren't the type that affect us at the level of our blood and breath. They were merely correct, as the German philosopher Martin Heidegger once put it. So I've learned not to be overly preoccupied with truths that are merely correct. Of course, our prevailing social order demands a certain irreducible amount of contact with truths of that sort, and there's nothing wrong with absorbing enough of them to get by. But life is far too short to spend a lot of time flooding our minds with oceans of inconsequential trivia. So I've learned to devote most of my time and energy to the truths that really seem to burn in some important way. So for me, lesson number 10 would be, the truths that burn are the important ones. But, of course, this has implications for the whole purpose of knowledge and understanding. Years ago, I used to think that the primary purpose of knowledge is to improve humanity's lot, especially by pursuing the kind of understanding that can yield practical advantages with respect to our world's realities. However, through the years, I've discerned that there's a deeper purpose than that. The deeper purpose of knowledge, at least as I see it, is to help us awaken to the reality we're inhabiting, to broaden our perceptual fields, and to intensify our experience of life. Of course, common academic wisdom would tell us that we're alive to understand things. But I've learned over time that we understand things to be more fully alive. So lesson number 9 for me would be, the point of pursuing knowledge is to help us awaken to the experience of life. However, as I said earlier, I've also learned that only a small fraction of academic truths readily fulfill that purpose. To me, the kind of truths that have the power to awaken us are mostly the ones that point beyond themselves, toward the dark sea of unknown things that we could possibly know eventually. That's true at the level of our individual knowledge, as well as with regard to humanity's collective stock of knowledge. Basically, the most powerful truths are also indicators of the unknown, markers of the ultimately mysterious nature of our world as well as our own mysterious nature. In other words, I've learned that our best knowledge is always in a secret, intimate relation with mystery. I usually like to think of this in terms of the importance of both knowing and unknowing the world. That is, to allow what we know to serve as a vehicle that lets us experience the deep mystery of things. So lesson number 8 is, As we pursue knowledge, it's important both to know and to unknow the world. Okay, so while these first three lessons have to do with the nature and purpose of knowledge, and by extension with intellectual activity more generally, the next three have to do with change. The first lesson I've learned with regard to change has to do with the ultimate impermanence of everything, including ourselves, our world, and our finest understandings of them. As the old adage goes, and this too shall pass. I feel that this is important, first because it's how reality actually works, but also because it has a generally deflationary effect on what would otherwise be our unbridled hubris, a deflation of our smug pretensions to mastery and our overweening sense that we currently possess the final answer to life's riddle. I've learned that the deeper reality is that everything we are and everything we value are always in the process of slipping away, of transforming, of dissolving and reforming in the vast, undulating ocean of time and space that surrounds us. Paradoxically, our existential lot is that the universe would not be complete without us, and yet it will soon dispense with each and every one of us, at least in the form of our ever-approaching mortality. So lesson number 7 is, and this too shall pass. So, given the fact that everything is ultimately in the process of transcending itself, then what about the kinds of changes we would like to see in ourselves and in our world? I think for me that the first answer to this question came by way of my contact with clinical psychology, where the primary paradoxical lesson was that we all want to change, and at the same time, no one wants to change. In other words, pretty much every one of us wants to fulfill our deeper possibilities in life, even if it's in a twisted and ultimately self-destructive way. And so, we all would like to change in ways that could make that happen. But at the same time, the last thing we want to do is change. In other words, most of the time, we don't move toward our hero's journeys willingly or easily. Most of the time, we have to be dragged, kicking and screaming into our deeper destinies in life. At one level, this would seem to be a formula for hypocrisy. However, for me, it's simply part of human reality. We are, after all, contradictory and inconsistent creatures a lot of the time. So for me, lesson number 6 is, we all long for change, and at the same time, no one wants to change. The next lesson has to do more specifically with how change happens in our world and in ourselves, and it again involves a kind of paradox, which is, for the most part, change happens as a function of what we're able to accept about ourselves and each other. Over the years, I've learned that when we thoroughly accept ourselves as we are, then what we are begins to change. On the other side of the coin, when we're desperately trying to force ourselves or other people to be a certain way, the main result is that it actually inhibits the dynamics of change. This is why acceptance is so important to many forms of psychotherapeutic practice, for instance. It's because we don't usually change when we feel like we're being treated in a pushy or shaming or coercive way. When we feel like we're being treated that way, we typically react in one of two ways. We either become angry and resentful and consequently even more defiantly entrenched in our habits and attitudes, or we adopt a false facade of conformity just to get through the unpleasantness of the moment. Either way, we're not actually changing, at least not in any substantive way. In other words, contrary to popular wisdom, it doesn't actually help our world grow when we're being hostile and confrontational toward it, when we're being way too impatient and strident, and way too self-absorbed and self-important too. Yes, approaching our world's problems that way can be pretty satisfying at a juvenile emotional level, but it doesn't actually help our world move beyond itself. All it does is harden the resolve of our old enemies, create new enemies out of previously neutral people, and generate new, deeper lines of division in our world, which is the source of most of our world's problems in the first place. So, all in all, For me, lesson number 5 is human reality changes mostly through acceptance and love, not self righteous outrage, shaming, and coercion. The fourth lesson I've learned along life's road is not to take myself or anything else in this world too seriously. Part of this lesson has to do with realizing how small and how transient our lives really are against the backdrop of the universe's incomprehensible immensity and grandeur. Of course, we act as though our agendas and concerns and desires are, or should be, of ultimate importance. But the reality, I find, is that life is divinely indifferent to all of that. Sometimes it gives us what we want, and sometimes it doesn't. Reality is capricious that way. It doesn't worship at the temple of our plans and projects. Only we, in our self-absorption, think that it should. But it obviously doesn't. So I find that it's best to learn to laugh along with life in all of its absurdity and capriciousness. For instance, within the run of everyday affairs, I often sense that the universe is in the process of telling one great big cosmic joke, and that we're actually part of that joke. And what life is asking of us is to start getting the joke if we can, and to learn to laugh along with it. And who knows, maybe if we're faithful enough to the reality we're experiencing, we might even start to tell the great cosmic joke ourselves. Anyhow, it seems to me that the whole dismal, dispiriting spirit of seriousness has reached toxic levels in our world. Seriously. Or maybe that's a joke. Anyhow, as I've reached middle age, it's surprised me to learn that the times when I'm most serious are, in reality, the times when I'm acting most like a buffoon. And the times when I'm joking and laughing the most are, in reality, the times when I'm being the most serious. And yes, that includes everything in this video you're watching. So, for me, lesson number 4 is, we learn best while we're laughing. Of course, this insight also applies to the whole project of cultivating intelligence. Basically, I've learned not to take intelligence too seriously either. Or to put it in somewhat different terms, usually the highest expressions of intelligence are also the funniest ones. As William Blake once put it, if the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. Anyway, it seems to me that one of the best uses of a refined intelligence is to recognize the limitations of a refined intelligence. If you're smart enough, you'll eventually realize that there's a lot more to life than being smart, and that cleverness, even incisive, articulate cleverness, can easily become a prison. So, as in the case of knowledge, it seems to me that intelligence is interesting and powerful only insofar as it can help us experience life more deeply. Otherwise, it tends to be overrated. What really matters in our world is wisdom, not intelligence. Consequently, for me, lesson number 3 is, cultivating intelligence is only part of life, only one possible path, and not necessarily the best or most important one. Remember that pretty much all of history's most vicious tyrants were also exceedingly intelligent people. And speaking of intelligence and learning lessons, I've also learned a few things about teaching, which is what I do for a living. And one of the deepest lessons I've learned is that we teach best what's most unresolved within us. Of course, in disciplines like mathematics and the natural sciences, this is probably less relevant, or at least less obviously relevant. However, in the domain of disciplines that have to do with understanding ourselves, things like psychology, sociology, philosophy, and anthropology, it seems very much true to me. Basically, I've come to the sense that under the surface, we teach what's at issue for us in some very personal way. For instance, I teach a course in existential psychology not because I have somehow mastered existence, but because underneath all of the fancy vocabulary and texts, I haven't mastered it. because existence remains, after all these years, still elusive and unsettled for me. Of course, common wisdom would hold that we should be teaching what we've thoroughly mastered, what we've completely digested and assimilated into our being. But I find that when we do that, when we simply convey things that aren't really at stake for us personally, it mostly leads to a desiccated, uninspired form of teaching. On the other hand, when we're conveying knowledge and insight from the deep well of our human struggles, from what's incomplete and unresolved in us, what's teetering in a precarious and personal balance, well, that's when teaching becomes something really human, something really vital and worthwhile. So for me, lesson number 2 would be we teach best what we most need to learn ourselves. And finally, those of you who watch my videos in any kind of regular way probably already realize that I'm a pretty enthusiastic holist. Oh, and by the way, side note, I want to tell you how much gratitude I feel for each and every one of you who takes time and energy out of your day to connect with what I had to say in these videos. I really appreciate that. So, props and a big thank you to each one of you for caring enough and being interested enough to listen. Anyhow, like I was saying, it seems to me that the spirit of holism is often misunderstood. Often, when people speak of holism, they're trying to conjure a vision of life ruled by lollipops, rainbows, and unicorns. In other words, by the positive and upbeat side of things. But life is always far more than that. So for me, holism also means laying claim to all that is dark and fractured and painful in us and in the world. It's about honoring life's principle of complementarity and recognizing that all that is difficult and unjust in this life is integral to all that is beautiful and uplifting. It's about realizing that life is asking us to experience all of it, to omit nothing, to assume our relation to existence as broadly as we can, as the poet Rilke once put it. It's about weaving the tapestries of our lives with threads of every color and every texture. So my number one life lesson from philosophy and psychology would be, life is irreducible. Of course, this can be a particularly terrifying and objectionable lesson, mostly because it means that we're less in control of things than we'd like to think. But on the other hand, as I've learned from Doctor Who, fear makes companions of us all. Thanks again for watching and listening.